Saint Francis believed that prayer was the natural language of the soul. To him, prayer was not effort. It was breath. Something the heart did instinctively when it remembered who it belonged to. He taught that even broken prayers were precious, even distracted prayers were heard, and even prayers spoken in fear still reached God. But there was one village where prayer had become something else entirely. Not a comfort. Not a refuge. But a danger. A place where words were carefully measured, where voices lowered at night, and where a single prayer was never spoken in full. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was feared. The prayer itself was not unusual at first glance. It was handwritten on parchment, its edges worn from years of careful handling. The opening lines were familiar, words of humility, trust, and surrender. The kind of prayer any faithful Christian might speak before sleep. But it was the final line that haunted the village. No one could remember when it was last spoken aloud. Only that when it was, something answered. Not with thunder. Not with fire. But with a presence so heavy it left those who encountered it unable to sleep, unable to speak, unable to pray again. And so, over time, the villagers learned to stop. They would pray together until the final line approached, then fall into silence. Parents taught children to pause. Priests closed their books before the words were complete. The prayer was never denied. It was simply never finished. Generations passed, and fear slowly hardened into custom. What began as caution became obedience. What began as obedience became law. Children were taught not to ask why. Elders spoke in fragments. The prayer was treated like a relic, holy, but dangerous. The chapel where the parchment was kept stood slightly apart from the village, as if even the stones knew it carried a weight. The bell above it had not rung in years. Mass was celebrated elsewhere. The villagers told themselves they were protecting their faith. But in truth, they were protecting their fear. The story of the prayer's origin was told only in whispers. It was written by a monk long ago, a man known for his devotion and severity. He fasted often. He prayed longer than others. He believed suffering purified the soul. But he also believed God's silence was something to be challenged. During a violent storm, he knelt in the chapel and prayed aloud, determined to finish the words no matter the cost. Witnesses later said the wind stopped suddenly, as if the world itself had leaned in to listen. The monk collapsed before the prayer was complete. He did not die immediately. But he never spoke again. And the prayer was sealed away. After that night, the villagers began to associate prayer not with peace, but with risk. Silence became safer than faith. Restraint felt wiser than trust. They convinced themselves that some words were better left unsaid. Some questions better left unanswered. And some prayers better left unfinished. They did not realize that what they were truly avoiding was not danger, but surrender. Saint Francis arrived quietly, as he always did. Barefoot. Dust-covered. Carrying nothing but his cloak and a heart trained to listen. He noticed the silence immediately. Not the peaceful kind. The practiced kind. When he asked about the chapel bell, no one answered him directly. When he asked about prayer, eyes lowered. When he asked about fear, the village finally spoke. "There is a prayer we do not finish," they told him. Francis listened without interruption. And then he asked a single question. Why? No one answered. Because no one truly knew anymore. That night, Francis asked to see the prayer. The priest's hands trembled as he retrieved the parchment from beneath the altar. The candle flame bent as if drawn by unseen breath. The air grew heavy. Francis read slowly. The words were not blasphemous. They were not defiant. They were desperate. The prayer was written by a man who believed God's mercy existed, but feared it might not apply to him. As Francis reached the final line, the priest closed his eyes. The village held its breath. And Francis stopped. Not out of fear. Out of reverence. Francis did not finish the prayer that night. Instead, he knelt. He prayed silently, not the words on the parchment, but for the soul that had written them. For the fear that had followed. For the generations who had learned to live with silence instead of faith. He understood something the village had forgotten. Prayer is not dangerous. Fear is. The next night, Francis returned to the chapel alone. He lit a single candle and knelt before the altar. He read the prayer again, this time without hesitation. And when he reached the final line, he spoke it. The air did not shatter. The walls did not shake. What came was quieter than anyone expected. A presence, not violent, not accusing, but heavy with sorrow. Francis felt it immediately. Not a demon. Not a punishment. A soul. A soul bound not by God, but by fear and unfinished repentance. Francis spoke gently, offering the words the monk had never trusted himself to accept. Mercy. Forgiveness. Rest. And the presence lifted. The chapel grew light. The prayer was complete. By morning, the weight that had pressed on the village for generations was gone. The parchment lay blank. The bell rang again. But Francis did not celebrate. He wept. Because he understood the deeper lesson. The prayer had never been cursed. It had been afraid. And fear, when left unchallenged, can silence faith for generations. There are prayers we learn as children. Prayers spoken from memory. Prayers spoken because everyone else is speaking. And then there are prayers that cost something. The prayer Saint Francis prayed that night was not dangerous because of the words themselves. It was dangerous because of what it asked God to do. It did not ask for comfort. It did not ask for protection. It did not ask for peace. It asked for truth. And truth, when spoken honestly before God, always exposes what we have tried hardest to hide. The villagers feared that prayer not because it might summon judgment, but because it might summon change. You see, there is a part of every human heart that prefers silence to surrender. A part that says, "Do not touch this." A part that whispers, "I will follow God, but not there." Saint Francis understood something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. God does not fear our darkness. But we do. We fear the moment when God answers a prayer not by fixing our circumstances, but by confronting our attachments. The prayer no one dared to pray was terrifying because it invited God to remove what was loved, not what was hated. It invited God to strip away false securities, comfortable resentments, righteous anger, spiritual pride disguised as devotion. It said, "Lord, do not leave me as I am." And that prayer is dangerous. Because God always answers it. Not loudly. Not violently. But faithfully. Francis knew that when a soul dares to pray that way, something must die. Not the soul, but the illusion it clings to. That is why the village trembled. They sensed, perhaps without realizing it, that God was near in a way that would not be ignored. A God who heals gently can be postponed. A God who heals completely cannot. Saint Francis did not pray that prayer to frighten the people. He prayed it because he loved them. He knew that faith without surrender slowly becomes a cage. That prayer without honesty becomes noise. That belief without transformation becomes a burden. And he knew something else, something painful. That many souls would rather live wounded than be healed. Because healing requires letting go of the story we tell ourselves about who we are. The prayer forced a question no one wanted to answer. What if God takes from me the thing I use to define myself? Who am I then? Francis believed the answer was simple. You become who you were always meant to be. Free. Not free from suffering. But free from fear. Not free from loss. But free from the illusion that loss defines you. That night, when the prayer was spoken, heaven did not thunder. The walls did not shake. No visible miracle occurred. And yet, something irreversible happened. A door opened. Not in the church. Not in the sky. But in the human heart. The most frightening prayers are not the ones God refuses to answer. They are the ones He answers slowly, patiently, relentlessly. Francis knew that when we dare to pray honestly, God begins to rearrange us from the inside out. And that is why so few people dare to pray as he did. Because surrender feels like loss. Until we discover what it gives back. The prayer no one dared to pray was not about inviting suffering. It was about trusting God more than comfort. It was about choosing truth over control. It was about believing that whatever God removes, He replaces with something greater. Saint Francis believed that heaven rejoices not when prayers are spoken beautifully, but when they are spoken truthfully. And the truth is this. God does not demand everything from us at once. But He asks for one thing continually. Our yes. Not tomorrow. Not when we are ready. Not when it feels safe. Now. That prayer still exists. It has never disappeared. It waits quietly. For the moment someone dares to speak it again.